In 1945, while Europe burned in the death throes of the Second World War and Berlin crumbled under the bombings, the entire world accepted almost with relief a story that perfectly closed the darkest chapter of humanity. Adolf Hitler, cornered in his bunker, had taken his own life alongside Eva Braun to avoid the humiliation of capture. It was a clean, categorical account, useful for giving way to reconstruction and to the New World Order. However, decades later, the journalist Gerrard Williams began to notice that among the cracks of that official version, there were too many gaps, too many inconsistencies, too many silences. And what emerged from those gaps was something disturbing, the possibility that Hitler had not died in Berlin, but rather had managed to escape, live in hiding and die in peace, far from any tribunal in a remote corner of Argentine Patagonia. Williams did not start from a conspiratorial obsession, nor from the search for sensationalism. His concern arose from a repeated pattern in documents, testimonies, and verified facts that pointed to an alternative scenario. The first thing that caught his attention was the absence of solid forensic evidence that confirmed the death of the Führer. The Soviet Union, which was the one that took control of the bunker, claimed to have recovered Hitler's remains, but those remains were never shown to the world. Worse still, the evidence that decades later was exhibited, fragments of a skull, turned out to belong to a young woman. It was not Hitler, and it was not Eva Braun either. At the same time, Williams highlighted a detail that, although evident, had been overlooked or considered irrelevant. There was not a single reliable eyewitness who had seen the exact moment of the death of Hitler and Eva. What existed were indirect testimonies, accounts transmitted from prisoners to Allied interrogators, and all of them full of contradictions. Some claimed that Hitler shot himself, others that he ingested cyanide, others that he did both. As for Eva Braun, the versions also differed. The scene of the burned bodies in the garden of the Chancellery, repeated again and again in history books, rested on the word of people who had more than enough reasons to lie or, at the very least, to repeat what their captors wanted to hear. For Gerrard Williams, the most revealing thing was not only the inconsistency of the evidence, but the reaction of key leaders in the months following the war. Joseph Stalin, for example, publicly declared at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 that Hitler had escaped, probably to Spain or Argentina. Marshal Zhukov, his most celebrated commander, was equally blunt. "We did not find anybody that could be Hitler's." Even Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, admitted in October of that same year that there was no conclusive proof of the dictator's death. These were not statements from fans of alternative theories, but from the men who had led the military defeat of the Third Reich. If Williams had learned anything as a journalist, it was that official silences were rarely innocent. And here there was an enormous silence. If the FBI, the British MI6 and other agencies had received for years reports about supposed appearances of Hitler in South America, why were those reports not thoroughly investigated? Why did many of them remain classified for decades? The answers that Williams began to reconstruct pointed to a political and strategic context that went far beyond the simple search for a war criminal. In 1945, the world was entering fully into the Cold War. For the Western Allies, the main enemy was no longer defeated Nazism, but Soviet communism in full expansion. On that new board, some Nazi leaders ceased to be irreconcilable enemies and became potential assets. Scientists such as Wernher von Braun were taken to the United States to boost the space program, while intelligence agents and military experts were relocated to work against the USSR. If discrete agreements had to be made to ensure that certain people or technologies did not fall into Soviet hands, they were made. And in that context, Hitler's escape was not a logistical impossibility, but a matter that could be managed with the complicity of those who saw more advantages than drawbacks in his disappearance from the public map. Williams followed threads that led him to testimonies in Argentina, interviews with elderly people who spoke without astonishment of the time when Hitler lived around here, declassified documents that showed that the FBI received detailed reports about sightings in Patagonia, and even persistent rumors within German communities in the south of the continent. What most struck him was the naturalness with which the subject was spoken about in some places, not as a fantasy, but as something taken for granted. For many families of German origin who had emigrated before or after the war, the presence of Nazi leaders in Argentina was no secret. It had been part of daily life in certain cities and towns. At the core of this hypothesis is the conviction that Hitler, with the help of Bormann and of Nazi networks already operating in South America, was able to leave Berlin before the capital fell. According to this line, doubles were used to maintain the illusion that he remained in the bunker while he and Eva began a carefully planned route. Underground tunnels, discreet flights to the north of Germany and then to Spain, stopovers in the Canary Islands, and a final transfer by submarine to the Argentine coast. It was a plan that required coordination, resources, and a chain of loyalties that could only be sustained with money and promises, something Bormann had in abundance thanks to the systematic looting of Europe. Like every uncomfortable story, this one raises questions that touch sensitive fibers. Why would the victorious powers prefer to allow Hitler to live? What price was paid in exchange? How far was the New World Order willing to go to ensure its own stability? Gerrard Williams did not claim to have all the answers, but he did see clearly that the official version had been accepted too quickly and without the verification that a case of this magnitude required. This introduction to the hypothesis of Hitler's escape is not a closed ending, but an open door. Once the starting point is questioned, the death in the bunker, a network of interconnected stories unfolds that goes far beyond a single man. There appear the escape routes designed by the Nazis even before the end of the war, the role of countries such as Spain and Argentina in offering refuge, the complicity of bankers, businessmen and politicians who saw in those fugitives an opportunity for their own ends. Williams knew that for many just the mention of the possibility that Hitler escaped was a provocation. But he also knew that uncomfortable truths are rarely welcomed with enthusiasm. His work did not seek to replace the official history with an alternative account lacking basis, but to invite consideration of the evidence that has been ignored or minimized. In a world in which the post-war period was built on tacit pacts and shared secrets, perhaps it was not so implausible that the most wanted man on the planet had managed to vanish into the shadows and rebuild his life, protected by networks that operated with precision and discretion. This is the starting point that awakens curiosity and at the same time discomfort. Because if one accepts even the possibility that Hitler did not die in Berlin, then the following questions become inevitable. How did he do it? Who helped him? Where did he live? What traces did he leave? Why was he never discovered? The answers, which will unfold as the investigation progresses, lead through a plot that crosses continents, involves top-level historical figures and forces, a reconsideration not only of the end of the Second World War, but of the way in which historical accounts are written and sealed. In that tension between what we were always told and what might have happened, between the comfort of the closed and the vertigo of the uncertain, is where the impulse to want to know more germinates. Because if this first point achieves anything, it is to open a path that can no longer be easily abandoned. The desire to follow the trail of that man who perhaps did not remain in the ruins of Berlin, but instead embarked on an improbable journey to a destination where the mountains and lakes of Patagonia would hide him from the world for years. A journey that, according to Gerrard Williams, was not only possible but could have been the last great maneuver of the Nazi machinery. Getting Hitler out of Germany, Operation Feuerland. Among the rumors, documents, and testimonies that Gerrard Williams was unearthing, one in particular stood out as the backbone of the hypothesis about Hitler's escape, an operation planned with almost industrial meticulousness to ensure the flight and settlement of the Nazi leaders in South America. That plan bore a code name as evocative as it was enigmatic: Action Feuerland. Far from being an improvised last resort when Soviet troops approached Berlin, Feuerland had begun to take shape long before the fall of the Third Reich. Williams maintained that Martin Bormann, the man closest to Hitler in the last years of the war and the true administrator of the Nazi Empire, had been the logistical and financial mastermind behind the operation. His vision was pragmatic. The Reich could lose the war, but its leaders and key resources should not perish with it. And for that, a refuge had to be prepared, a transport network and an international support base capable of remaining secret. The south of Argentina and Chile was the ideal setting. Isolated, vast, with German communities established since the end of the 19th century and receptive governments, by ideological affinity, by economic interest, or by both motives, it offered the perfect hiding place. According to Williams, Bormann began to move pieces from 1943. Transfers of capital to South American banks, shipment of gold bars, jewels, works of art, and even military technology through safe maritime routes. These were not simple isolated escapes, but an organized migration of resources that would guarantee not only the physical survival of the fugitives, but also their comfort and capacity for influence in exile. An essential part of Feuerland was the use of bases in Spain and the Canary Islands as intermediate stations. Spain, under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, offered a neutral but friendly space for the Nazis. From there, flights, submarine transfers, and the refueling of ships could be coordinated. Williams mentions, based on reports and statements from the time, that airstrips and fuel depots were even built for long-range planes, such as the Focke-Wulf Condor, which could take the fugitives to strategic points of the Atlantic. The operation also had a component of political protection and cover-up. According to Williams's line of investigation, there was a tacit pact with certain sectors of Allied intelligence. In exchange for advanced military technology and for the delivery of information about the Soviet Union, the escape of key individuals was overlooked. The spoils of war were not limited to gold and art. They included secrets such as rocket designs, medical experiments, and weaponry techniques that could tip the balance in the Cold War. Feuerland not only foresaw the arrival in Argentina, but also the installation in specific properties already prepared to receive the newcomers. Large estates in Patagonia, chalets in the Bariloche region, and safe houses in Buenos Aires were part of the network. The new tenants would not be refugees living in poverty, but discreet guests with access to luxuries, armed protection, and a social network that maintained a pact of silence. For Gerrard Williams, the most disturbing thing about Feuerland was not its existence in itself, but the evidence that it had worked. Testimonies from sailors, intelligence documents, and even observations recorded by diplomats pointed to the arrival of German submarines on the Argentine coast after the surrender of Germany. The most famous case was that of the U-530 and the U-977, which surrendered to the authorities in Mar del Plata weeks after the official end of the war, after mysterious voyages whose purpose remains a matter of speculation. In Williams's view, Action Feuerland was the last great logistical victory of Nazism, an operation that achieved what seemed impossible, taking Hitler out of the heart of the besieged Third Reich and bringing him to a sanctuary thousands of kilometers away while the world celebrated his death in Berlin. It was a plan that not only saved lives but preserved power, influence, and wealth, enough to allow part of the Nazi ideology to remain alive in distant lands for decades. And it is here where the narrative thread that begins with Feuerland connects with everything that would come after: the escape route, the landing in Necochea, the settlement in San Ramon, the collaboration of the Argentine government and the international cover-up. Without understanding Feuerland, it is impossible to comprehend how Hitler could disappear from the official map and, according to Williams's thesis, begin a new life at the end of the world. Shadows in the mirror: the use of Hitler and Eva doubles. In the account that Gerrard Williams was assembling from documents, testimonies, and strategic silences, There is an element that borders on the cinematic, but that, according to him, was key for the escape plan to work: the use of doubles of Hitler and Eva Braun in the last days of the Third Reich. It was not a new idea. Even before the war, the Nazi security services had trained and protected men physically similar to the Führer for purposes of propaganda and personal security. The difference in 1945 is that those doubles became a tool to build the final scene that the entire world would accept as true. The situation in Berlin in April of 1945 was desperate. The Soviets advanced street by street, and in the Chancellery bunker the atmosphere was one of inevitable defeat. It was the perfect scenario for a deception: confusion, fragmented communications, witnesses under pressure, and the imminence of catastrophe. According to Williams's hypothesis, one of the most convincing doubles was the one tasked with dying in place of Hitler, presenting the image that would later be recognized by some prisoners and interpreted as proof of suicide. The procedure would have been carefully orchestrated. The double, dressed in the characteristic uniform, would be prepared physically: same hairstyle, same mustache, even facial details imitated with makeup, to impersonate the Führer at the critical moment. Once dead, the body would be moved to the Chancellery garden and burned quickly, just as the official testimonies describe. The burning, carried out hastily and without proper means, would ensure that the later identification was unreliable, especially in a Berlin reduced to rubble and under constant fire. Eva Braun, according to this same line of investigation, would also have had a double. The young woman who appeared alongside the Hitler of the garden would not have been the real Eva, but a woman carefully selected for her resemblance. Here the key would be that the face was left sufficiently damaged by fire so as to make a conclusive identification impossible. Thus, while the narrative of a pact of suicide was being consolidated, the true couple was beginning the escape route foreseen by Action Feuerland. Williams emphasizes that the contradictory versions of the witnesses about the exact moment of death fit with this possibility. Some claimed to have seen Hitler alive and active shortly before the supposed hour of suicide, others that the body found did not entirely correspond to his build. As for Eva Braun, the accounts differ even as to whether she was present in the previous hours or if she had been seen in other areas of the bunker. The use of doubles not only created a perfect alibi but also bought time. Every minute that the Soviets invested in verifying, or taking for granted, the identities of the corpses was a minute gain for the real Hitler and his entourage to advance in their escape toward the north of Germany, and from there, following the chain of protection and transport of Feuerland, to leave the continent. In this context, the official story does not collapse all at once, but rather cracks, and by looking through those fissures, the figure of the double becomes more than a trick of espionage. It is the first great act of a carefully choreographed disappearance, where the confusion of defeat was the best ally of the one who sought to erase his tracks. The Wolf's Route, from ruined Berlin to the end of the world. The escape of Hitler, according to the hypothesis presented by Gerrard Williams, was an operation as precise as it was risky, a journey that led him from the heart of a ruined Berlin to the southernmost tip of South America. It was not an improvised escape in the midst of chaos, but a sequence of movements planned months in advance, each one designed to minimize risks, take advantage of safe routes, and hide his trail under layers of confusion and bought loyalties. In the last days of April of 1945, while Soviet artillery shook the German capital and the tanks of the Red Army closed the encirclement over the Reich Chancellery, the plan was activated. The first phase consisted of leaving the bunker without being detected. For that, the underground tunnels that connected the government complex with other parts of the city and its surroundings were used. These galleries, built in part as escape routes in case of a siege, led to sectors still under the control of German units. There, under the protection of carefully selected escorts, Hitler and Eva Braun could be moved to a point from which to begin the aerial escape. The next step was to reach an airfield beyond the immediate reach of Soviet forces. Williams's hypothesis suggests that the initial transfer may have been toward the north of Germany or even Denmark, areas where loyal contingents were still operating and where it was possible to organize a long-range flight. The priority at this stage was to avoid any confrontation and to move with enough discretion so that neither Soviet nor Allied intelligence would detect the presence of the fugitive. From there, the journey continued to Spain, governed by Francisco Franco, a regime officially neutral but with ties of sympathy toward Nazism. Spain offered military airfields and strategic coasts that could serve as connecting platforms toward the Atlantic. One of the key stops, according to the indications gathered by Williams, was the Rius Air Base, where an aircraft change would have been made to adopt the cover of the Spanish Air Force, thus hiding the trail of a German military flight in the midst of the post-war. From the peninsula, the trip went to the Canary Islands, a vital stopover point due to its geographical position and because of the infrastructure that, according to various testimonies, had already been established before the end of the war. The mysterious Villa Winter on the island of Fuerteventura and the facilities in Gran Canaria were part of that network. Their supplies, communications and transfers to German submarines that were waiting in the area could be coordinated. The most delicate and dangerous part of the entire journey then began, the Atlantic crossing on board a U-boat. The submarine assigned would have been one of those from Gruppe Seewolf, veteran of long-distance missions and modified to transport high-profile passengers. This stage required maneuvering far from the routes most patrolled by the Allies, maintaining absolute radio silence, and refueling at previously agreed points, possibly in Spanish enclaves or even in disguised support ships. For weeks, the vessel advanced toward the south, submerging during the day and surfacing only as necessary at night to recharge batteries and renew the air. The arrival on the Argentine coast took place, according to this version, at the end of July of 1945 near Necochea. It was the middle of the southern winter, an advantage to operate under a cover of fog and little maritime activity. There, local collaborators awaited, among them Hermann Fegelein, who had prepared vehicles and logistics for the landing. The operation was carried out quickly. The passengers were transferred from the submarine to the beach in smaller boats, while armed men watched the perimeter and gave agreed signals to the U-boat crew. From the beach, a convoy took Hitler, Eva, and their entourage to an improvised runway on a nearby estate. There, an Argentine military plane awaited them, a Curtiss Condor, ready to make the last leg of the journey. The destination was Patagonia, a region of vast spaces, difficult access, and a strong presence of German colonies from decades earlier. After several hours of flight, the aircraft landed in a field of San Ramon on the outskirts of San Carlos de Bariloche. The plan had culminated. The most wanted man on the planet had crossed half the world and was now in an isolated environment, protected by loyal support networks and by a government that, at least on some of its levels, was willing to look the other way. Each stage of the journey had been designed to dissolve his trail in the chaos of the post-war period, and each step had counted on the complicity of individuals and structures that acted out of ideology, for money or for political convenience. On this route, one sees not only the logistical capacity of Hitler's closest circle, but also the reach of an international network that survived the fall of the Third Reich and knew how to reconfigure itself to protect its key figures. What for official history ended in the ruins of Berlin, in this reconstruction was only just beginning with the journey to the other end of the world. Hitler's arrival in Argentina. In the narrative reconstructed by Gerrard Williams, the arrival of Hitler and Eva Braun in Argentina was not an improvised leap into the unknown, but the culmination of a journey designed with precision, whose final stretch was executed with the same coldness and planning as the rest of the escape. It was the moment when the plan moved from theory to practice on South American territory, and when the collaboration networks built over years had to prove their effectiveness. The setting of the arrival was the coast of Necochea in the province of Buenos Aires, a point far from major commercial ports, and with wide and open beaches, ideal for a discreet landing. It was the end of July of 1945, the middle of the southern winter, and the weather offered a strategic advantage. Low temperatures, little fishing activity, and a dense sea fog that reduced visibility. Williams recounts that according to collected testimonies, the submarine U-518, or a similar vessel linked to the Gruppe Seawolf flotilla, approached at dawn, advancing at minimum speed so as not to be detected by coastal patrols. On land, the reception was in the hands of Hermann Feuerland, brother-in-law of Eva Braun and high-ranking SS officer, who would have arrived weeks earlier to coordinate the logistics of the landing. Feuerland had arranged for a small group of trusted men, some with military experience, armed and distributed in strategic points on the beach. The objective was to guarantee a secure perimeter for the landing and the immediate transfer of the newcomers. When the U-boat surfaced, the lookouts on the coast made the agreed light signals. A motorboat set out from the shore toward the submarine, guided by flashlights and brief flashes to avoid drawing attention. Hitler, Eva, and the small group accompanying them, including his inseparable dog Blondie, descended through the hatch and boarded the small craft. The testimonies describe a quick and silent scene, the exchange of military salutes, hands extended to help the woman and the animal aboard, and the immediate return to the coast. On the beach, the contact with firm ground was brief. Feuerland personally helped Eva down, while other members of the group assisted Hitler, whose appearance after weeks of travel in claustrophobic conditions was far from the charismatic leader that propaganda had immortalized. Pale, emaciated, with his moustache shaved and his hair grown out carelessly. Even so, he maintained a rigid bearing and responded with a formal gesture to the salutations of the men who awaited him. From that point, the group was quickly taken to a nearby estate, known as Moromar, used as a temporary refuge. There they were provided with clean clothes, food, and rest, in addition to burning the garments and objects that could reveal their origin. Eva Braun, according to the account, kept some personal items that gave her an illusion of normality: her favorite perfume, a luxury lighter, American cigarettes, and Canadian whiskey. The stay in Moromar was brief. The plan contemplated that the definitive transfer to Patagonia should be carried out as soon as possible to avoid any risk of detection. The following morning, an Argentine military plane, a Curtiss Condor biplane, arrived at the grass runway of the estate. The choice of such an aircraft was not casual. Its presence would not arouse suspicion in the region where the transit of military and transport aircraft was common. The flight took the group to the town of Neuquén, in the north of Patagonia, and from there they continued southwest, flying over landscapes of steppe and mountains. According to Williams, this stretch of the journey impressed Hitler, who until then had only heard of Patagonian immensity as a concept. Now he saw from the air snow-covered mountains, endless lakes, and a geography capable of hiding any secret. The final destination of this journey was the San Ramon estate, near San Carlos de Bariloche. This property, acquired years earlier by the family of a German prince, was in a strategic location, isolated, accessible only by dirt roads, and close to a consolidated German community. Here, Hitler and Eva would find the starting point for their new life in exile. The arrival in Bariloche was not a clandestine event for everyone. In the region, the presence of Germans was common and, in many cases, welcome. Families of German origin had founded businesses, schools, and clubs, and maintained a social fabric in which connections with Europe were strong. This environment, together with the geographical isolation, offered an almost natural protection network. The arrival of visitors with a German accent did not arouse suspicion, and even less so on a private estate where access was controlled. Williams mentions that, according to various sources, in the days following the arrival, there were visits from local figures and from members of the German colony, some of whom knew or intuited who the newcomer was. Discretion, however, was part of the tacit pact that ensured everyone's safety. As long as no one spoke, all benefited from the presence of a man who, for some, was still a leader, for others an opportunity for influence and resources. The role of the Argentine government at this moment is a key point. Under the presidency of Juan Domingo Peron, Argentina maintained an ambiguous policy. Officially, it condemned defeated Nazism, but in practice it offered refuge to numerous former leaders and collaborators. The arrival of Hitler, although not officially confirmed, fit into the pattern of receiving high-profile figures, always under strict confidentiality and with the backing of contacts in the police, the army, and the local administration. The logistics of this last stretch, from the landing to the settlement in San Ramon, reveal the reach and the coordination of the network that operated in his favor. It was not only a group of loyalists moving to protect him, but a transnational structure that included sailors, pilots, landowners, officials, and civilians willing to follow orders without leaving a documentary trace. Each link in the chain had a specific and limited function, so that few knew the entirety of the plan. For Gerrard Williams, this moment marks the true success of Action Feuerland. Once in Patagonia, Hitler and Eva could disappear from the international radar. The geographical remoteness, the difficulty of access, the complicity of the local community, and the protection of a favorable government created a perfect shield. From then on, the account of his life would remain in the hands of indirect witnesses, rumors and sporadic appearances that would feed the legend without putting the protagonist's safety at risk. The arrival in Argentina, far from being the epilogue of the story, was the beginning of a completely new chapter. From there, Hitler could maintain contact with other fugitives of the Reich, follow closely the events of the post-war period, and even influence, in a limited but real way, certain political and business circles. The network that had brought him did not dissolve, but adapted to protect him in the long term, ensuring that his anonymity was his greatest defense. The image of that landing in Necochea and of the subsequent flight toward the mountains sums up, for Williams, the contrast between the official narrative and the alternative hypothesis. While the world believed that Hitler had died in a basement in Berlin, a man very much like him, but alive, dressed in Argentine clothes and accompanied by his partner, crossed the Pampas heading toward an exile that would last years. And it is precisely in that contrast where the fascination with this point of history germinates, because it forces a reconsideration not only of the truth about his fate, but also of the real reach of the networks of power that, at the end of the war, decided who would live and who would fall into the hands of justice. The refuges of Argentine Patagonia, where Hitler stayed. It was not chance that led Hitler and Eva Braun to settle in Patagonia, but a strategically and carefully calculated choice. The region offered something that few parts of the world could provide in 1945: geographical isolation, abundance of resources, and above all, a German community already settled, well organized, and with a tradition of loyalty to its roots. There, among mountains, lakes, and forests, they could disappear in plain sight, protected by the silence of those who, whether by ideological affinity or personal convenience, had no interest in betraying them. San Carlos de Bariloche, epicenter of this German presence, was much more than a picturesque tourist destination. Since the beginning of the 20th century, families arriving from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland had founded businesses, social clubs, and schools in which the German language and European customs remained intact. It was, in a certain sense, a cultural extension of old Europe, but located in a remote corner of the Andes. For the newcomers, this environment represented a natural refuge. They could integrate without arousing suspicion, live among compatriots, and maintain a low profile without giving up comforts. The San Ramon estate, where, according to Gerrard Williams, they initially settled, was a perfect example of the infrastructure awaiting high-profile fugitives. A property linked to German aristocrats, it had vast hectares of land, access controlled by dirt roads, and a location that combined beauty and isolation. From there, one could dominate views of Lake Nahuel Huapi and of the Andes, while at the same time being far enough from the city to avoid unexpected visits. Life in this new refuge was not reduced to mere survival. Hitler's close circle would have worked to recreate a routine that, although more modest than that of the Berlin Chancellery, preserved certain rituals. Meals prepared with local ingredients adapted to European tastes, correspondence carefully filtered, and a controlled flow of visitors, mainly members of the German colony, and envoys from other regions of Argentina or Chile. Bariloche, moreover, was not isolated from the rest of the continent. Through contacts in Buenos Aires and in Chilean cities such as Puerto Montt or Valdivia, the German community maintained a constant exchange of news, goods, and people. This facilitated communication with other Nazi refugees who had settled in South America, as well as access to goods not produced locally. The network functioned informally, but it was extremely efficient. Williams points out that over time, the presence of Nazi figures in the region ceased to be an absolute secret and became an open secret. Some inhabitants could recognize faces or names, but the norm was not to speak of it, and much less with strangers. This discretion did not only respond to ideological sympathies, but also to a closed community culture, in which mutual protection was a way of preserving stability and avoiding problems with the authorities. Patagonia, with its vast and difficult-to-access geography, also provided a natural defense against any attempt at capture. Any official investigation, should it occur, would require time, resources, and the cooperation of a population little inclined to collaborate. This, added to the lack of real interest on the part of the Allies once the Cold War was consolidated, made the region a practically impregnable hideout. In this way, the settlement in Bariloche was not only an act of escape, but a transition toward a new stage, that of a hidden but stable life sheltered by a community that had already proven to be a logistical and social support for other fugitives. There, among postcard landscapes, the boundary between myth and reality was diluted, and the idea was cemented that perhaps the most wanted man in history had found in Patagonia a place where he could die of old age, far from the judgment of the world. Juan Domingo Peron and the Nazi collaboration. The secure stay of Hitler and Eva Braun in Argentina would not have been possible without high-level political backing. That backing had a name and surname, Juan Domingo Peron. The Argentine leader, who had come to power in 1946, had cultivated ties with Germany for years, both through diplomatic relations and through contacts in industry and the army. His political vision, marked by strong nationalism and an ambiguous stance toward the victorious powers of the war, made him receptive to the idea of offering refuge to figures of defeated Nazism. Peron was not an improviser in this field. During his time as military attaché in Italy, he had closely observed the machinery of fascism and, according to different sources, had been impressed by its capacity for organization and social mobilization. Upon returning to Argentina, he wove ties with businessmen, technicians, and European officers, some of whom years later would be key pieces in the arrival and reception of fugitives of the Third Reich. The official policy of Argentina after the war was ambiguous. On one hand, the country joined the Allies late, declaring war on Germany and Japan only in March of 1945, a gesture more diplomatic than military. On the other hand, beneath the surface, active channels were maintained to facilitate the entry of Germans, Italians, and Croats, many of them with compromised pasts in the war. This duality allowed Peron to project an acceptable image internationally, while covertly carrying out a policy of hospitality toward individuals who could provide technical knowledge, economic capital, or strategic influence. In this context, the arrival of Hitler and Eva Braun fit into an already tested pattern. The so-called rat lines, escape routes to South America, were operational thanks to the coordination of Nazi networks, the Vatican, and local sympathizers. Argentina, with its extensive coast, its European communities, and a state apparatus willing to issue documentation, was a privileged destination. The newcomers could receive new identities, official papers, and a legal domicile that protected them from any international claim. Williams argues that for Peron, offering refuge to Hitler was not only a gesture of ideological affinity, but also a calculated political move. Having in the country the defeated leader of Nazism under strict control represented symbolic capital within certain nationalist and military circles. Moreover, the presence of high-profile Nazi figures served to strengthen the image of Argentina as an autonomous country that did not fully submit to the demands of the United States or the Soviet Union in the new post-war order. The collaboration was not limited to the issuance of documents or passive tolerance. There was an active infrastructure to guarantee the security of these refugees. The federal police and sectors of the army operated as a shield, ensuring that any foreign investigation encountered bureaucratic walls or simple refusals. In regions such as Patagonia, informal surveillance was left in the hands of the local community, which acted as a natural barrier against strangers or curious journalists. In the case of Hitler, the level of protection would have been extreme. The San Ramon estate and other possible refugees in the region had trusted personnel, warning systems for the arrival of intruders, and escape routes to Chile, crossing the Cordillera through little guarded passes. The security network also included contacts in the judicial and political sphere who could intervene in the event that any official indication of his presence arose. The position of Eva Braun within this framework was different. Although she shared the isolation and the security measures, her public role was nil. Unlike other refugees who, over time, were able to integrate into commercial or social activities, she remained in the background, dedicated to domestic life and to a small circle of friends. This low profile contributed to maintaining the secret and prevented her presence from arousing suspicion. The support of Peron and of his circle allowed the presence of former Nazis in Argentina to go unnoticed by much of the world for years. Only starting in the decade of the 1960s, with the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann by the Mossad, did the magnitude of that reception network begin to come to light. However, by then, those who had arrived in the years immediately after the post-war period, including, according to Williams's thesis, Hitler, were already leading consolidated lives, with identity and environment secured. Thus, the collaboration of the Argentine government was not a minor detail in this story, but a fundamental pillar. Without political cover, bureaucratic complicity, and the protective cloak of the security forces, Hitler's stay in the country would have been unsustainable. It was that alliance, discreet but effective, that allowed the most famous fugitive of the 20th century to walk, even if in the shadows, through a country that welcomed him in silence. Did the CIA allow Hitler's escape? The possibility that Hitler managed to escape from Europe and live hidden in South America, according to Gerrard Williams's investigation, cannot be understood without considering an element that extends far beyond Argentina: the complicity, active or passive, of certain intelligence sectors and allied governments. Williams's hypothesis does not limit itself to pointing out well-organized Nazi networks. It maintains that, in the context of the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, there were international actors for whom allowing the Führer's escape was not only not a problem, but could even prove beneficial. In 1945, the map of world power was changing rapidly. Germany had been defeated, but the enemy that now worried Washington and London was not in Berlin, but in Moscow. The Soviet Union, which had borne the greatest burden of the war against Hitler, emerged from the conflict with a military capacity and political influence that deeply unsettled the West. For the new strategic interests, certain enemies of the past could become useful pieces if they served to stop communist expansion. In that framework, Williams argues that there was a tacit incentive not to pursue some Nazi leaders with the same determination. Programs such as Operation Paperclip in the United States, which incorporated German scientists into military and space projects, or the reclassification and protection of Gestapo and SS intelligence agents to use them against the USSR, demonstrated that pragmatism had displaced justice as a priority. The question Williams raises is simple but disturbing. If there was a willingness to forgive or integrate key figures of Nazism, why not apply that same logic to Hitler himself, as long as his silence and retirement from political life were guaranteed? There are declassified FBI and OSS, precursor of the CIA, documents that reinforce this line of thought. Reports of sightings of Hitler in South America were filed away or considered low priority, even when they came from reliable sources. Some of these notifications described in detail places, dates, and circumstances, but thorough investigations were rarely opened. Williams interprets this attitude as a sign that there was an implicit order: do not search too much, do not stir up what could prove uncomfortable. The supposed complicity was not limited to the United States and the United Kingdom. Within Spain, Franco's regime maintained an ambiguous relationship with the Allies, offering occasional cooperation while protecting Nazi fugitives in transit. That Iberian corridor, which connected with maritime routes toward America, would have functioned with the knowledge and tolerance of certain Western diplomatic offices. If the objective was to keep Hitler out of Soviet reach, letting him disappear in a remote corner of Argentina turned out to be a functional solution. Williams suggests that this possible international connivance had a component of long-term calculation. The figure of Hitler, officially dead in Berlin, served as a perfect closure for the narrative of Allied victory. But alive and hidden, under indirect control, he became a card that no one needed to play as long as he remained invisible. This would explain why, unlike other famous Nazis such as Eichmann or Mengele, Hitler was never the object of a sustained global hunt. The cover-up in this scenario did not necessarily imply secret meetings between leaders to plan the escape, but something more subtle, a coincidence of interests that led to looking the other way. The Allied bureaucracy could bury reports, minimize leads, and let time do its work. The more years passed, the less likely it seemed that the Führer was still alive, and the easier it became to dismiss any report as rumor or myth. In this way, international support, or at least calculated inaction, becomes a central element in understanding how such a disappearance could be sustained over time. Williams suggests that it was not only the skill of the Nazi network in South America, but also a global political context that, without proposing it explicitly, favored the most wanted man in history vanishing into the shadows while the world focused on a new enemy. Voices in the shadow, testimonies, and evidence. The hypothesis that Hitler survived the end of the Second World War and lived hidden in South America is supported by a heterogeneous set of testimonies, documents, and records that, although scattered and fragmentary, draw a pattern difficult to ignore. It is not a single decisive proof that topples the official version, but rather an accumulation of indications that, taken together, form a coherent alternative account. One of the pillars of this evidentiary base is the declassified FBI documents. Throughout the decades after 1945, the agency received reports from various parts of the world about alleged sightings of Hitler, many of them in Argentina. Some came from anonymous informants, but others were signed by people with credibility and positions of responsibility. In several cases, the descriptions were detailed: precise places, specific dates, names of companions, and even daily habits of the fugitive. However, these reports rarely motivated intensive search operations, and many were filed as without follow-up. To these documents are added testimonies collected in interviews with direct or indirect witnesses. Williams and his team traveled through Argentina, Chile, and other countries in the region to speak with elderly people who claimed to have seen the Führer or to have heard direct stories from relatives and acquaintances. In towns such as Bariloche or Villa La Angostura, It was relatively common to find people who recounted fortuitous encounters or jobs carried out for a German with a strange accent who lived apart and under a false name. There are also references in Soviet archives in which the doubts expressed by high commanders of the Red Army about Hitler's death are recorded. From the very end of the war, figures such as Stalin and Marshal Zhukov publicly stated that they had no conclusive proof of his death and that, on the contrary, they believed it likely that he had escaped. These records not only show that the official version was not universally accepted in 1945, but also reveal that uncertainty remained alive in circles of power for years. Another recurring element is the reports of observations recorded by diplomats and intelligence agents. Some reports describe movements of German submarines on the Argentine coast after the surrender, as well as the arrival of unidentified passengers who were discreetly taken inland. In certain cases, the dates of these activities coincide with the documented landings of U-boats such as the U-530 or the U-977, which officially surrendered weeks after the end of the war, following long voyages without satisfactory official explanation. Williams also incorporates more subtle evidence, such as old photographs showing men with features similar to those of Hitler, taken in rural settings of Patagonia in the decade of the 1950s. Although none of these images provides conclusive identification, their mere existence, together with the oral testimonies, feeds reasonable doubt. In this field of investigation, where each discovery requires years of work and access to sensitive sources, Williams also denounces the misappropriation of his material by other authors. Researchers such as one whose initial is A and whose surname begins with B have profited and stolen material, evidence, and clues discovered by his team without giving due credit and presenting them as the fruit of their own work. This dispute is not minor. It highlights that even within the world of those who question the official history, there are tensions, competition, and self-interested uses of information. The most striking thing for the researcher is that many of these elements, instead of being treated as pieces of a puzzle to solve, were discarded or ignored for decades. This lack of interest or follow-up reinforces the idea that more than a problem of scarcity of information, what existed was an absence of political will to get to the bottom of the matter. Thus, the set of testimonies and evidence that Williams presents does not seek to replace the weight of a definitive forensic proof, but to show that the official history rests on a much less solid ground than is believed. And it is on that ground, full of voices speaking from the shadow, where the possibility opens that the final chapter of Hitler's life was not written in Berlin, but in some remote corner of Patagonia. In addition to the FBI documents, the Soviet archives, and the testimonies collected in Patagonia, there are other pieces that broaden the panorama and that Gerrard Williams considers equally revealing to support the hypothesis of Hitler's escape. These are evidences and circumstances that, although sometimes appear peripherally, fit as additional pieces of a puzzle that has never been officially solved. One of these elements are the banking and financial movements recorded in the final years of the war and in the immediate post-war. Various researchers have found traces of transfers of large sums of money from accounts linked to the Third Reich toward banks in Argentina, Switzerland, Uruguay, and Paraguay. These flows coincided with the transfer of gold, jewels, and works of art stolen in Europe, many of which were never recovered. The magnitude of these operations suggests that it was not only a matter of safeguarding capital, but of financing an infrastructure capable of sustaining for decades high-profile individuals who had to remain hidden. In parallel, there is maritime evidence that adds to the already known cases of the U-boats U-530 and U-977. Reports from the Brazilian Navy and from local fishermen describe the presence of German submarines in the South Atlantic on dates after the surrender. Some of these vessels never officially surrendered and, according to naval records, disappeared without a trace. Williams interprets these facts as possible resupply or fugitive transfer missions destined for specific points on the South American coast, from where the passengers could move inland through previously organized routes. Another striking indication comes from the field of infrastructure in Patagonia. In the decades of the 1940s and 1950s, roads, airstrips, and buildings were constructed in remote areas, financed in part by German or Austro-German businessmen recently arrived. Although many of these projects were presented as tourist or agricultural initiatives, their locations and characteristics, restricted access, proximity to little-guarded border crossings, coincide with places where sightings or rumors about the presence of former Nazi leaders were reported. The culture of silence in certain communities is also considered a weighty factor. Testimonies from former inhabitants of Bariloche and Villa la Angostura describe an attitude of extreme reserve toward outsiders, especially journalists or foreign authorities. Asking about the German who lives apart or about the couple who barely go out not only received no answer, but could provoke an open rejection. This conduct, according to Williams, was not due solely to ideological sympathies, but also to a network of favors and mutual protections in which many had something to gain and much to lose if the secret came to light. Even on the international level, there are documents that show a restricted exchange of information between Allied and Latin American intelligence agencies. Some of these reports, now declassified, reveal that the embassies in Buenos Aires and Santiago received data about suspicious movements of high-profile German individuals. However, the reports were archived or answered with vague instructions such as "observe but do not intervene" or "do not pursue for now." This pattern reinforces the hypothesis of a tacit tolerance towards certain refugees, possibly under unofficial agreements. To all this are added anonymous accounts of people who, decades later, dared to tell what they knew. Some speak of having worked as domestic or maintenance staff in estates of wealthy German owners, where they were warned not to approach certain areas or not to engage in conversation with certain guests. Others recall having seen a man of military bearing, with scars and a foreign accent, whom everyone treated with deference and whose real name was never mentioned. The whole of this evidence does not offer a final confession nor an irrefutable forensic finding, but it broadens the framework of possibilities and, above all, raises a disturbing question. Why do so many pieces fit into a narrative that official history completely dismisses? Williams suggests that the answer lies in the convergence of three factors: a perfectly oiled Nazi network to carry out escapes and resettlements, a global political context that saw more risks than benefits in capturing Hitler, and local communities willing to protect those who, in one way or another, could represent power or influence. Thus, the other evidences only reinforce the central idea of his investigation, that Hitler's disappearance, far from being a conspiratorial fantasy, was the result of a complex, international and sustained operation over time, whose success depended as much on logistics as on the shared silence of all those who participated in it. Hitler, the mystery that still lives. If anything is made clear by Gerrard Williams's investigation, it is that history as we know it is not always an immutable record of facts, but many times a construction carefully shaped by interests, silences, and omissions. The figure of Hitler, frozen in the official narrative as a corpse in a bunker in Berlin, could, according to this hypothesis, have continued breathing far from Europe, protected by a network as extensive as it was invisible, fed by stolen resources, fanatical loyalties, and the complicity, or convenience, of governments and intelligence services. It is not only a matter of debating whether the man escaped or not. It is a matter of what that possibility means, that historical truths can be negotiated, that justice can bend before geopolitics, and that, at times, endings are nothing more than necessary fictions to close uncomfortable chapters. If Hitler lived in Patagonia, as the evidence and testimonies gathered by Williams suggest, then the myth of suicide was not a mistake, but a tacit agreement that benefited many and betrayed millions. The final image that remains in the mind is not that of the defeated dictator in a basement, but that of an old man with a dark gaze, walking by a southern lake, far from the bombs, from judgment, and from the immediate memory of the world. A man who had achieved the unthinkable, to deceive history itself. To accept even the possibility of this outcome is to open the door to an uncomfortable truth. That the darkest chapter of the 20th century may have gone without justice, and that in the cracks of history the shadow of those we believe defeated can always hide. Because perhaps after all history does not end with a shot in Berlin, but with a whisper in some forgotten corner of the world where the echo of impunity continues to resound.